There we go. You are all welcome to join us at the Marquis Wellington, including you, Dan, at the presentation, for those of you who are with us live. I'm really happy to have Dan as our speaker today. He's one of those members of our own department. He's a postdoctoral research associate on the ArchiveScan project. He has very diverse research interests: epistemology of archaeology, identity, machine learning, Roman eating and drinking practices, and as we'll see tonight, imagined narratives. He's asked me to forego plugging any of his recent publications, forthcoming publications, because they're hidden away in his own presentation. So I'm really happy to have our own Dan van Helden with us today. Yeah, we look forward to your presentation. Please welcome Dr. van Helden.
Right. Well, thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm going to start with some disclaimers. I will not be showing any archaeological evidence. I will just be musing about thoughts that I had. Now, this will surprise none of those of you who know me, but I thought I'd preface this anyway. The topic of my talk is closely related to what Selina Wisdom talked about last December. But she had the experience of having actually done any of this, and I've just thought about it. So there's a bit of difference. There's enough to distinguish the two talks. I should also say that this is not only my work. This is based on the work that I did with Dr. Robert Witcher. And so at least half the clever things are his, though most of the jokes are still mine. And I should also acknowledge all of the contributors to the volume that we published on this topic. I can't point out everywhere where they've influenced me, but certainly as a collective, they have been very, very influential on my thinking on this topic. One way in which my thinking differs from well, much of the work that's been done on fiction in archaeology is that I am unashamedly academically selfish. Fiction is often used as an outreach tool and often discussed in discussions about how to talk to the general public or to school-age children. And this discussion is often parallel to general discussions about the benefits of literature or the lack thereof. And I'm going to largely ignore all of that, and I'm just going to think about what does it help us? What do we get out of it as academics? So it's all well and good to talk to other people. I highly encourage that, but that's not what I'll be talking about tonight. Another partly disclaimer. Let's be honest. The point of my saying yes, let's all make it up is not to deceive people with lies. It is to think more freely and to hopefully find truths by letting go of the strict criterion of provability or of the limits of the evidence. So I am not saying it's okay to tell lies to everyone and make up stories about aliens building pyramids. That might be enjoyable, but that's not what I'm here to argue in favor of. So roughly what I'll be talking about is some of the history of fiction and storytelling in archaeology, the unavoidability of story, what we might get out of fiction, some personal anecdotes, and a little bit about some of the political implications of making stuff up. And so to start with the history of fiction in archaeology, and most of the discussions on making things up are summed up roughly by this picture, and the text here, which says in Spanish, which I will not butcher, so I'm going to stick to the English. The sleep of reason produces monsters. The general idea is that once we start making things up, well, anything goes. There is no more. There's nothing more to distinguish the proper archaeologist from the conspiracy theorist. We can all make things up, and all of sensible archaeology is really done for, because who's going to tell the difference? I don't quite agree with that reading, of course, but it's an old one, one that we can potentially even trace back to Thucydides having a go at Herodotus for making stuff up. So now he that not believe that things were such as the poets have sung or prose writers have composed more delightfully to the ear than conformably to the truth, he, I say, shall not err. So stick to your evidence, and make sure that you stay on the straight and narrow. This is also this line of thought runs longer, and people have traced the baleful influence of fiction in archaeological discourse as well. So there's a really interesting chapter about the influence that Treasure Island has had on the archaeology of piracy, and this can be traced through the assumptions with which people approach the evidence. A similar case can be made for Gustave Flaubert's Salammbô, which portrays the Carthaginians as child sacrificers, which has arguably colored a significant portion of the interpretations of Carthaginian tophets or child cemeteries. Whether or not you think that is that is due to Flaubert or due to wider cultural influences, or whether you consider it to be correct, I'm not going to touch on that now. But there is demonstrable, or at least argued, evidence to suggest that the reading of fiction has influence on us as archaeologists. Some of these thoughts, they creep into our academic work. And it's not always only some people policing the boundaries and others freely jumping across it. These positions can also be found within the same person. So Mortimer Wheeler wrote in a review of Collingwood's Roman Britain and the English settlements that Mr. Collingwood has adopted a personal and subjective attitude towards history that must either be accepted or rejected by the reader at the outset. He interpolates motives, builds characters, constructs episodes with a liberality and even license that is great fun, but liable to shock the pedant. Fact and speculation stand shoulder to shoulder, no documents are cited, the innocent student may not know with what voice his author speaks. So here is very much, this is dangerous, and we should save the innocent reader from the vile influence of speculation. Now he himself, when writing about Maiden Castle, writes this often cited passage as very evocative language. It's often seen as an exemplar of accessible and engaging writing. And he writes, "Men and women, young and old, were savagely cut down before the legionaries were called to heel." This is about the storming of Maiden Castle. "That night, when the fires of the legions shone out in orderly lines across the valley, the survivors crept forth from their broken stronghold and in the darkness buried their dead." Now, this may not strike as particularly fictional, and indeed he himself wrote that something less than imagination was needed to go from the evidence, the archaeological evidence, to this reconstruction. The only problem is, of course, that this has later been questioned whether, in fact, it was something less than imagination, and whether the archaeological evidence was quite as unequivocal as Wheeler made it out to seem. So was he, in fact, making it up? Story time. Because I think that sometimes we have, as archaeologists, or maybe as wider academics, we have a bit of a tendency to take our metaphors too seriously. So I'm going to go for one that's wildly ridiculous and see what happens there. And because it is story time, I shall read from the actual book rather than from the screen. On the Discworld, people take things seriously, like stories, because stories are important. People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. Stories exist independently of their players. If you know that, knowledge is power. Stories, great flapping ribbons of shaped space-time, have been blowing and uncoiling around the universe since the beginning of time. And they have evolved. The weakest have died, and the strongest have survived, and they have grown fat on the retelling. Stories twisting and blowing through the darkness. And their very existence overlays a faint but insistent pattern on the chaos that is history. Stories etch grooves deep enough for people to follow in the same way that water follows certain paths down a mountainside. And every time fresh actors tread the path of the story, the groove runs deeper. This is called the theory of narrative causality, and it means that a story, once started, takes a shape. It picks up all the vibrations of all the other workings of that story that have ever been. This is why history keeps repeating all the time. So, if we take this seriously, just for the moment, then what happens if we what happens if we consider this to be true for the moment? That the knowledge of stories shapes people. Knowledge of stories shapes history, and then we should be pursuing these stories. And I hope that this is not as ridiculous as that sounds. Because I've got an example of story shaping history. Turfschip van Breda, translates roughly as the peat ship of Breda, is a ploy employed by the Dutch rebels in the 80 Years' War, where the Netherlands rose up and tried to gain independence from Spain. Though it wasn't going very well at the beginning, but at some point, a young commander, Prince Maurits, figured out a trick. Because Breda was being supplied with peat for fuel, this peat was brought in from the surrounding countrysides on barges. What if we hide some soldiers in the barge? It gets sailed into the stronghold. The soldiers get out, and as a Dutchman, I should say, liberate the city. Let's keep it a bit more neutral. Conquer the stronghold, and it worked. The city was captured with almost no losses on the rebel side. But it's clear he didn't come up with that. Not only did some other bloke come up with it and suggested it to him, and he claimed it, but also Homer came up with it way before that time, and he didn't think of this himself either. So clearly, the presence of stories shapes the way in which humans think, and if it is our aim to reconstruct in some way the ways in which the past operated, we need to also keep our minds open to the stories that they considered, but also the ones that we've come up with. So all stories have an influence. The thing is, good stories have more influence. Those are the ones that grow fat. The other ones die out. So we need to tell good stories. And of course, this isn't only applicable to us telling fiction. You are allowed to tell good stories which are completely in accordance with the evidence and stay well within those limits. Tell those stories as well. But we shouldn't be drawing a sort of a cordon sanitaire around around stories or around fiction, because they are stories and fiction and therefore dangerous. Because not telling a story is not a realistic option. We can't just say, well, I found 25 pots of this type, 25 pots of that type. This is it. That's A, you're not going to get your message across, and B, somebody else is going to get their message across using that data. So you don't really have an option of not telling a story, because all is a story. Reality is far too complex for finite humans. We use stories all the time to make sense of the whirling chaos that is life, the universe, and everything. We project a story in order to make this chaos make sense. We select a starting point, a midpoint, an end point, and this is how we choose which elements of reality to include in this story. And this is how we make sense of the world. If we didn't do this, we'd all go screaming mad, because it's too vast and bewildering. So why fiction? Why not just stick to the facts? It's simply the logical extreme of some of the storytelling arguments. But also, it allows for freer exploration of our understanding of the past. If we let go of the strict confines of the evidence, and we follow the thread of the story, or we follow where our interest takes us, we might end up in a place of greater understanding. So some of the benefits of fiction for archaeology. It allows us to identify and perhaps even plug some of the gaps in our knowledge. It allows us to humanize our narratives. It allows us to insert emotionally marked information which is processed differently from simply raw data. It allows us to open some of the black boxes that we generally operate with, and it allows us to avoid teleological thinking. But also, and this is the way in which we often engage with historical fiction, this is through nitpicking. We've all seen historical films, and where, especially if we see them with our archaeologist friends, we then sit around afterwards in the bar, and we poke fun of, oh, they got this wrong, they got this wrong, they got this wrong. It's great fun, and I'm assuming we've all done it, and it's really useful. It's useful for us as well. These discussions point us towards what we should be thinking about this. The problem is, though, what is accuracy? If they got this wrong, is that the most important one? I've had discussions like this where 3 or 4 people all roughly did the same degree, sat down and watched the film, and we all took umbrage with different elements. Some of them thought, oh, well, this detail of the sandal was terrible. Others said, oh, that's irrelevant. This is a modern political idea being portrayed through a historical narrative. And what is it that you take issue with? And when we discuss this, it's a useful trick to get us to think about stuff that we thought we knew. Because sometimes we know, oh, this is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. But why? Sometimes we grow so comfortable with our own implicit understanding that we need something to shake us out of this. And historical fiction, and maybe particularly bad historical fiction, can help us do that. It also can help highlight the gaps in our knowledge, because we're used to thinking about our evidence. And it is easy and normal to stop where the evidence stops, because we're used to talk about what it is that we found, what it is that we should be discussing, and we're trained not to go beyond that because we're on thin ice then. But it is very easy to then slip into to thinking that that is what the past was like, whereas we've got a very limited view, and sometimes it helps to be pointed to have our faces pushed to where we don't know, just because that contextualizes the things that we do know. If I know X amount and I think that that is all, that is a very skewed view of my own knowledge. Whereas if I know the vast bit that I don't know, and I'm being forced to encounter that, makes for very different thinking. Some of you may have written fiction. The fiction writer cannot remain on the fence where I, as an academic, are most comfortable. I'm very comfortable sitting on that fence and not coming down. I can say, well, I don't know. It could be this or it could be that. If you're writing fiction, you don't have that option. You're forced to choose the most plausible, or the one that the option that works, and that in itself forces new thoughts. And so forced choice can open up new ways of thinking. Now, I should again say I've not done this, but I have talked to people who have described this this very feeling of, all right, I don't know, but I can't stop here. I have to go further, and this, and then they pursue different lines of research in order to inform that decision, which otherwise they would not have followed. Fiction also allows us to humanize our narratives. Archaeology is about people, but our evidence is usually not. There's several steps of inference removed from the people that we're studying, and one of the ways to reintroduce the people into our narratives is to imagine them in there. This is, of course, deeply political, because which groups which humans do we introduce? We know that certain groups were written out of history, but that doesn't mean that they weren't there. They did exist, but we know nothing of them. Can we, using fiction, reintroduce them and force ourselves to think through the lives that they may have led, in order to broaden our understanding of the larger process of history? The question then, of course, becomes how to represent them, because it's tricky to write about somebody else, let alone if you're just making it up, and they're not here to defend themselves anymore. So, and this has been criticized because we're probably likely to err on the safe side of making the downtrodden worthy and politically inoffensive. And so Andrew Fleming, in this lovely little quote, says that, well, maybe they were nasty. They could have been nasty. Why are we treating them as pleasant and inoffensive people? Well, they could have been cannibals. We don't know, but that's why we shy away from it. This is very much to illustrate the risks involved. But I like this quote so much, I didn't want to steal that from you. There is some evidence that information that is affectively marked is processed differently to non-affectively marked understanding. This is you understand information with an emotional value attached to it differently to just the information. And if this is true, then empathy can perhaps be a source of information, of a source of understanding of a past that is no longer here. But empathy needs characters. We need humans to empathize with, and fiction can provide those. It should be noted that this is not necessarily better information. I'm not claiming some magic transportation into the lives of those people who lived in the past, but it is different information. This is a personal thing that I experienced when watching BBC's Claudius. The scene where Augustus banishes Julia from Rome because apparently she slept with half of it, and he's a bit of a puritanical man, and so he banishes her. And I knew this story, and I always, perhaps naively, thought, oh well, at least she kept her head. But in this scene, Julia is banging on the doors of the palace, beseeching her father not to send her away from human company. And this really changed my view of, oh, wow, okay, we're talking about something terrible here. She's not being sent away to just to live out the rest of her days. She's sent into isolation, which is horrible. Again, I could have perhaps got to this conclusion using in different ways, but this was a particularly powerful one that really changed my understanding of some of the things that I took for granted. Right, opening black boxes. We're comfortable talking about very different scales. History is lived at a different pace than it is studied. So how do long-term processes work at the level of individual lives lived? So if we talk about the emergence of agriculture or something, we know that this is a process of hundreds of years. People don't live hundreds of years, they live subsets thereof. How does a partial or a partially developed end product, how does that develop through the individual lives of actors? That's really difficult, but it's rather easy to gloss over it as archaeologists, because we're not forced to go down to the level of the individual. Yet fiction may help us consider and think through such questions. Now, I should mention that I've not read a fictive account that really does this for the emergence of agriculture, but I'm holding out hope. Fiction also allows us to, or helps us to avoid teleological thinking. The present is chaotic. This is why we have such trouble forecasting the future. Historical distance allows us to distinguish what turns out to be the signal from the noise. The problem with historical hindsight is that we lose sight of alternative outcomes. Outcomes that the people who lived at the present, in that present, didn't think were completely logical to not pan out. So I often find myself, and again, this may be a bit silly for an archaeologist, but if I'm on a site and then you hear, all right, they erected this stone building only to pull it down 10 years later. So why would you build for 10 years? Well, of course they didn't build for 10 years. And they didn't consider at that time the future in which this was not a fruitful way of maintaining this building. But we sometimes need to be reminded to forget the ending. The alternatives that still existed as possibilities then are equally important for the understanding of the past present, and sometimes it helps to be brought into this past through a fictive narrative. Now, there's also some risks, because of my love of Claudius. This is what I think of when I think of Claudius. The problem is, this is how he chose to represent himself, as Claudius subduing Britannia, which is an image of rape. That is not pleasant. That is not the kind Claudius that immediately springs to my mind. So I need to be, in this case, I need to be careful not to erase that version with this version. But this risk exists with any type of narrative, fiction or non-fiction, narrative or non-narrative. And we need to keep in mind that people can be multiple things, and this is not something that is unique to fiction as an archaeological tool. So I've alluded to some of the politics, and some of that stems from the fact that any story has to be selective. We employ stories to select from the maelstrom of reality. There's no sense in the bombardment of things that are happening. They make sense if we put them in a certain order. But we choose which elements of reality that we employ in these narratives. And so we can have equally true but non-compatible stories, even about the same bit of reality. No one story can ever be the truth, and any story is therefore partial and political. Which parts of reality do we choose to tell our stories about, or to incorporate in our stories? And which stories do we tell with those elements from reality? So if we take just the single fact that women are underrepresented in higher positions of higher power, we can create different stories about those. We can assume a level playing field, and we can say, well, women are just not as ambitious. We can also assume equal ambition and say, well, the playing field's not level. And the question is, how do we judge between different stories? And when we're not talking about stories, we're quite familiar with how do we judge these things. But when there's stories, somehow we feel that those no longer apply, which I don't think is true. But the question of authority, if the archaeologist starts making it up, who do we believe? Who's there to tell who we should believe in? Not? And this is it's a frame in which we cast things. If we assume that the archaeologist has to operate on authority, then we have authoritative true accounts. We are sanctioned by degrees, which are sanctioned by the universities and by extension by the state. But in many ways, they come across as just so stories to the outsider, or they have the potential to do that. Whereas if we change this slightly to an archaeologist's responsibility to tell responsible stories, and then to allow a multitude of stories to be told and to be judged on their merits, I don't think that is a very dangerous path to tread. The idea that stories tyrannize and infantilize their audience, because when you tell a story, how can I respond except with a polite smile, a yawn, a laugh, or another story? I don't think that that's necessary. We have options. We can evaluate stories on many different levels. we can discuss the narrative merits, structure, appeal, character, and so on. But we can equally discuss non-narrative merits. How well do they accord with the available evidence? And how much of that evidence, how partial and selective are they? What are the politics of the story? Or what are the political implications of it? What stories are we comfortable telling? And should that matter? Or perhaps should we, to the opposite view, should we be telling the stories that we're not comfortable with, or that our audience might not be comfortable with? I don't think that this is particularly difficult. It's not a bridge that we shouldn't cross. It's not something. It's not a radically different kind of beast. And one way of doing this, and here I'm going to slightly veer away from fiction so as to also give something to those people who I've thoroughly alienated by now. One way I think that this can be done is by talking about process. So rather than the story, tell the story of how you got to your story. Why are you reconstructing the past in the way that you do? What's the thought process in there? And which bits did you make up? If you did, which bits did you not make up? Be open and honest about the gaps in your stories. Yeah, here I didn't know, so I made it up. Or here I didn't know, so I didn't make it up. I refrained from coming down the fence, but you should know that there is a gap here. We don't know everything. And I think that the public wants to know this story, partially because the public is interested in people, and you are the closest person to that story. If they get to the story through you, and they're interested in you as the communicator as well. And this allows a closer evaluation of the story's logic. It removes the authority somewhat by just not approaching them as the teacher that's telling them something, but as an equal who has a story to tell. It removes the authority. It also removes some of the sting of the attack on authority. If the audience doesn't want to accept an authority, they don't have to. Also, it gives us the opportunity to train the audience to question all narratives, whether it's yours or somebody else's, and therefore sidestep some of the undesirable, or at least the ones that I think are undesirable, just so stories that might be out there. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, partially because it works best in conversation, where you allow the audience through question and answer, or through the yelling of rubbish, to engage with you and to smooth over any difficult bits. Now, this is of course not the way in which most communication about archaeology takes place. It's relatively rare that we sit down with people who aren't already archaeologists to talk about these things. It also supposes an audience that's willing to listen. And this is, of course, a bit of a hostage to fortune. But my feeling is that if the audience is not willing to listen to your story, they wouldn't be willing to listen to your story if you claim that you were the authority and therefore should be believed. I don't think that is really where the two processes differ. Now, to come back, I'm not arguing that everyone should be writing fiction. Not every publication should include a fictional vignette. We shouldn't have compulsory creative writing classes for all students, but I think that we should allow ourselves a little bit more license to explore the past in a fuller way, even where the ice is thin. Fiction and stories in the archaeological process allow for a more accurate appraisal of the status of our own narratives. They improve and broaden our understanding of the past. It allows for a partial, at least, neutralization of an attack on authority, which would affect a traditional government-sanctioned story more. And we can allow more engaging stories to be told to academic and lay audiences. And we can have more fun at conferences. One of the best conference papers I ever sat in was a story told by Michael Given about the slag and mining in Cyprus. And the audience was completely spellbound. You could hear a pin drop and we were hanging on his every word. It was definitely the best one. And it got us thinking about the things that he wanted us to think about. And so I come back to this one, where the sleep of reason might produce monsters, but the full epigram that Goya wrote with this says, fantasy abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the origin of their marvels, which I think is a lovely note to end on. Thank you for your attention.
Awesome, thanks. That's really good, Dan. Thank you so much for that. What we'll have now is we'll go ahead and open up to audience questions. So if you're online, you can raise a hand. In fact, I see Simon's already done so. And then we'll also invite questions from the live audience. You can go ahead, Simon. You can either unmute or you can actually go and unmute.
Hi, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed that presentation. Particularly, I liked that you mentioned Michael Given's story about the mining in Cyprus. I was in that audience too and was incredibly struck by it. I also struck me that actually a lot of what you were saying was remarkably familiar to me. Can you hear me okay? Because my own image I'm seeing here is pausing and breaking up. Is my sound okay?
Yes, your sound is fine.
Thank you. Okay. A lot of what you were saying is very familiar to me because it's something I've looked at myself extensively over a long period. And there is an important analogy in archaeology for the kind of things you're talking about, in which we already create such fictions. And this is the visual analogy. This is reconstruction image creation. A number of things you were saying there are things I have myself published when talking about reconstruction images, like when you have to do a reconstruction drawing, because I have been a reconstruction illustrator, you can't sit on the fence. You have to actually decide what something looked like. And that can also include, of course, choosing the people who are in the scene, what they're doing, what their relations are. So there is a striking analogy here, which is certainly worth your while thinking about what we're already doing in terms of images. And one of the things I came to realize in doing reconstruction illustrations is not only do you have to jump off the fence, but also the process of doing this prompts new questions. And again, to back up some of the things you were suggesting, to kind of exploit the potential of this, it's very valuable to explain the process of going from the archaeological evidence to the actual reconstruction which you then offer. And something I've myself done is to present alternative competing visual reconstructions, which again is an analogy perhaps of your multiple stories. So I very much like the idea of the possibility of having multiple competing fictional textual narratives. They could be a really interesting, potentially powerful heuristic device. And again, I especially would back up your idea of using this to encourage people to be critical of the narratives that they read, particularly historical ones, not least in our post-truth age.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I can only agree. It makes me. I think I once approached you for a paper in one of the fiction sessions that underlay the volume, and it makes me that much more sad that you weren't able to do so. So thank you.
Sorry, I'd already published all those thoughts anyway.
I'm not having a go.
Okay, we definitely have time for more questions.
Can I just follow on with what I was also thinking about? I wondered if you had any thoughts about maybe the differences, forms of fiction, like the visual, you have
I'm sure they do, but I'm on even thinner ice here than because I haven't studied literature studies or image studies in any form. My own experience is that the biggest divider I see is between fiction that has characters in and fiction that does not.
Oh, do you want to work the question into your answer? Because we have people who couldn't hear it.
Oh, yes. So the question was whether and correct me if I'm misquoting you here, whether the medium of the fiction, so whether it's visual or textual, whether that makes a difference in how it works. So yeah, my experience suggests that the main difference is in fiction or narratives with characters and without characters. Of course, that doesn't fall on either side of your suggested division, because there's the comic books and there's narrative drawings as well with main characters. That's the most where I've experienced the difference is strongest. Although, just thinking, I have experienced this with single drawings a bit as well, but I hesitate to say anything definitive here because I've not explored this very in any detail.
Definitely have time for more questions.
Feel free to do so, but if you violently disagree, I ask that you save it to the pub, because then I've got at least a few people to defend me. Ollie.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that talk. Obviously, it was really reminiscent of lots of the kind of things Simon was talking about, and lots of kind of debates, thinking about the way in which fiction was used in the kind of classic post-processual era, Janet Spector and Mark Edmonds and people like that, right, in that kind of way. And I was just wondering, do you think, and this is asking you to go perhaps a bit beyond where your interests are, whether some of the recent moves in archaeological theory might challenge the relationship between fact and fiction, between narrative and non-narrative? You know, I was thinking about the way in which that concern with the worries about relativism, for example, which underlie that kind of are we making it up questions, the worries about the role of narrative, and that made me think, really, especially in this place, of the work of Mark Chenik, who wrote so much about that, you know, formerly of this parish. And then just thinking about how those concerns, which were so central in the 80s and 90s, they don't seem to crop up in the archaeological theory that I read a lot at the moment. And I wondered if you thought that the kind of shift towards the other kinds of questions represented by archaeologists interested in new materialism or post-humanism or ontology or any of those other kinds of concerns that have been contemporary in various parts of the archaeological literature, if there's a reason why that question about fiction and narrative hasn't been as central as it was to post-processualism, with its emphasis on archaeology as texts and language and all those kinds of things that were so central to the 80s and 90s. And I mean, I know that's not necessarily your direct area, but I was wondering if you could sort of speculate a bit.
Yeah, I could certainly try. I think that the main difference might not be in text versus non-text, but in the centrality of humans. If you move away from centering humans, then some of these avenues seem less promising. It's more difficult to, for instance, empathize with an assemblage. And maybe the temptation is to use the old word. The temptation to try and empathize with the humans of the past is less prevalent. and therefore fewer people of that theoretical persuasion might be drawn to it. I think that's about the extent that I can defensively go to, because I literally haven't thought of it that much more.
Okay. I thought I saw another hand rose on online. I might have a. Oh yeah, it's Sarah. If you want to go ahead and pose your question, Sarah. You can unmute if.
Yes, sorry. I'm not very good. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah. Look, I just wanted to say to Dan, thank you very much. And I'm an honorary in the department at the moment, and I'm an archaeologist, but what I'm doing is learning screenwriting, and I'm writing fiction. So I found that very, very interesting. And I'm also finding it very, very interesting to go in to learn screenwriting, nothing to do with archaeology. And I would just make the comment that, I mean, from my experience, and looking at what I'm doing in writing screenplays for fiction as an archaeologist, is just how much of the storytelling that we're learning, what I'm doing, is about the individual and about characters. It's very, very character driven. And it's all about the resolution of conflict. And I mean, I think we can all see that when we watch commercially produced films or television programs. And I think also maybe that's been raised. I thought there is a difference between the way you storytell in, commercially produced films and television versus peer-reviewed academic publications versus visualization. But I just wanted to say, I'm very interested in it, and I can send you some comments by email.
I'm very happy for comments.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you very much. I won't say more, but I will send you some comments.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Dan. I wonder if you can comment on, or I guess, how important do you think like a character's choices in a story? Is that like a key part of storytelling? As maybe that makes it difficult to tell a story of the past, is if we have to have characters making a choice, or I mean, perhaps it makes it interesting also.
Yeah, no, I think it is difficult. I think it's why we have dedicated storytellers and dedicated fiction authors, because it's not something that we can necessarily pick up on a Tuesday afternoon. It takes a lot of work. I think that the choice that those choices and the resolution that follows from them are crucial. And I think this is where it might be difficult to tell stories without fiction, to tell as effective stories without fiction, because we need to make up the alternatives that weren't chosen.
Yeah.
In some cases, we know a few, but the alternatives that weren't chosen, so the options that the protagonist or the characters are wrestling with, some of them have to be reintroduced by us, and I think that it is that partly that process of either writing it or thinking along with the character that make it so potentially fruitful for our understanding.
Yeah,
does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my favorite parts of your talk was this idea of kind of illuminating alternative narratives that could have but didn't happen. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Any other questions from the audience? You'll take one from back here.
Going back to your answer before, do you not think that there could be compelling narratives and storytelling centering non-human beings or actually objects, right? Like object biography is a big thing in archaeology for a long time. And some great works of fiction have actually centered, so for example, Victor Hugo's Notre Dame of Paris centered the building rather than the characters around it. So do you not think that compelling narratives can be taken from outside of that human perspective?
Yeah, now there's a few thoughts. Just for the benefit of the online audience, I'm paraphrasing the question as: can you not have stories about non-humans are human characters necessary? I think that you can have stories, certainly stories about objects. So object biography, I think, is a prime example of that. And I think that there is definitely merit in that. I think that some of the benefits that have struck me when I was consuming fiction, they work more strongly when characters are present. While you are absolutely correct, there are stories out there that centralize the object. Often it is then the people around that object that grip you into the story and that drive the narrative. So I'm not saying that it is impossible. I'm saying that it's potentially more difficult, and that I've encountered more of the more success with the ones that also at least presented human characters.
Cool. We have a question from online, I think, from Bianca.
Yeah.
Yes, no, just because it has to do with the last question. I've been trying to remember since the beginning of the talk, and I unfortunately cannot remember for the life of me the name of the person that presented a talk in the PGR conference a few years ago, and she was studying the skeletons of medieval animals. And she decided, after she created the database and she had all the evidence and she had to do something with it, she decided to create the stories of the lives of those animals. And that brought all the color to the research that did exactly that, showed us how it affected the humans around them and vice versa. So, and it was a great talk. And like you said, because it's a story, it's like you're more open to it than when you are actually evaluating method and results and theory and all that. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that because I absolutely agree with everything.
Yeah, Bianca, is it possible it was Roman British dogs?
Maybe.
That's Lauren Bayless?
Lauren Bennett,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you for remembering the name. I was gonna be trying to remember this forever.
I think I missed that one.
We have time to squeeze in one more question. If someone wants to, here we go, Jose.
This is a question or a comment, but I'll just make it on the side. So the other day, reading precisely on this well of wisdom that is Twitter, I read a comment about the author of Mouse, this famous comic, which represents the Holocaust, and the Jews are represented by mice, and the Germans are represented by cats, etc. And this comic was so important, it was given a Pulitzer Prize, I think, and the New York Times listed it as a fiction book, in its highlights of recommended book, it listed it as a fiction book. So the author writes to the New York Times and says, can you put this in the non-fiction list? So I think it's interesting that you are arguing from the point of view of someone who works with data to try to work more with fiction and with storytelling. But very often in literature, we find people arguing, I write fiction, but I deal about the truth, or I deal about very real things.
Yeah. No, it's So I think you could probably find many things to quibble with in my choice of terminology. I think that I would very much see the fiction that I'm interested in this talk as a tool to find truth. Ideally, that would be truth about the past that I'm studying. But many people would suggest that literature is using made-up things to find greater human truths, and that might transcend time. So I don't think that I'm necessarily in disagreement with with authors trying to saying, well, this is not fiction, this is truth. I might be arguing to a slightly different audience, and therefore trying to choose different vocabulary to perhaps ruffle some feathers.
Okay, very good. I realize also, Dan, we have a question from Isabel. It's just asking for the title of your book again.
Yes.
And perhaps while he's doing that, do you think you multitask and hear a question from Selena?
I can certainly hear a question.
Yeah, let's take one final question, and then we'll head to the pub. If you
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. It's not so much a question, just as well, some reflections on questions that have already been asked about this issue of what is the difference between using different literary forms, and then again what Sarah was saying about screenwriting. I think drama, is absolutely primarily about conflict and about dynamics between people, and different literary forms allow you to focus on different things. So, for instance, one of the reasons I chose to write my plays as plays was because I wanted to focus on those interpersonal dynamics and characters without worrying so much about what the environment looked like. Now, of course, when you translate that into TV or film, it's very important what the environment looks like. With drama, not so much, because staging could be more idealized, for instance. But then when you come to prose writing and written fiction, I think that is the most flexible and gives you the most options, because there you really get to choose what you want to emphasize. If you want to describe a scene in great detail, as in from the point of view of the characters, what are they seeing, what are they experiencing, you can do that. But equally, you don't have to if you want to focus on other things. And I think that is the strength of prose. And the format of the novel in particular is also often about individual experience. It's about funneling it through one person's point of view. And so that allows you to do something different again. But then you don't have to. That you can switch perspectives, you can switch points of view much more flexibly than you can with other forms.
Thank you. I think I'd be very, very interested to explore this more. Especially, maybe we can have another talk at some point, because you've actually done this. So I'm very keen to talk to you about this. I think that there's other people waiting to use this room, so I'm going to really quickly end my response.
All right. Yes, please. Let's talk more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys. So we discovered the limits of whether we can overuse the room. It turns out it's not possible. Thank you, Dan, so much for the talk. Appreciate it. We're going to go to the Marquis Wellington. Please, everyone who's here, come. Final round of applause for our speakers.